Great, thank you. So Dave, I think, is going to be our first speaker, and Dave is going to be talking about church planting and revitalisation in today's secular society. And then Tom is going to follow that up with a bit of a case study, I suppose, looking at the example of perspective cliché. So, Dave, I think I can pin you, which I think will
I'm the
make you visible to
co-host.
everybody. There we go.
I'll share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, you should probably see my screen now, I hope. Great. Um, so the recording is in progress, as they say, from the American. And this is, to start off, this is like a general overview, a little bit of Mission Today, with this big title, Church Planting and Revitalization in Today's Society. So I wanted to talk a little bit in that sense about my ministry to show how some of these principles are very, very important. This is a bell curve I often use when I'm talking about ministry. When I first started getting involved in church revitalization, I was thinking very much down here, a church which is in danger of extinction and trying to save a church. And then little by little, the thinking within Europe moved up to here to saying, well, when a church starts to decline, maybe we should start thinking of what principles we're using and so on. And then went back even further than that to a church which is starting to plateau to say, well, maybe these principles should be used there as well. And in today's world, church planting, for example, in Clichy, I'm right down here and saying the same principles are needed even for a church plant. So I'd like to talk a little bit about secularization. The challenge, I think, is to take into account the context in which we're in, that is today's secular society, and in many ways the need to reconnect. And that was actually the title of the book I wrote, published by IVP, Reconnect Your Church, a practical handbook for church revitalization. And since I work quite a lot all across Europe with the European Leadership Forum, I've been quite flattered that this book is now not only in English as a French version called A Healthy Church. It's been translated into Croatian and Romanian. It should be coming out in Slovakian between now and Christmas. We're working on a version in Hungarian and possibly Bulgarian. So what we're saying is this is a Europe-wide need to see how we church plant and revitalize churches in the European context. So the first thing before we get into more detail, just so that we understand what we mean by secular, and the second question is how can our faith be plausible in this secular context? So this is a definition of secularization, which I got from a French sociologist. Secularization expresses the tendency of individuals to dispense with an obligatory reference to any religious affiliation. So this is in fact a very deep trend in the last 50 years, if not more. The weakening of religion in the mindsets of citizens in two areas: in social mores, that is, what is considered to be good or bad socially, and in public institutions. So in fact, secularization is a very long process, and I preferred this to the word secularism. And ism is an ideology, and I don't see this as an ideology. It's more, firstly, an observable sociological phenomenon. You can see what's happening, and this has been happening for at least 500 years. Probably some people put the origin in Amsterdam, for example. Let's say in the 16th century, where there were Protestants and Catholics and Jews, and they had to live together. So the institutions had to work in such a way that various religions or none were acceptable. On the other hand, as time goes by, this sort of philosophical relationship between religion and the state is translated into legal terms through the political process. What can you do? What can't you do in various contexts? And in France, we call this a very special French word, laïcité, difficult to translate, but it's the political process whereby the relationship between religion and the state is defined. And I think within France, the laïcité is very clear. We've learned to live with it. It has positive aspects, but I don't think we've thought enough about the secularization aspect of things. So one way you can think of secularization is by measuring, for example, the percentage of a population identifying as atheist, agnostic, or without any religious affiliation. So in 2022, 53% of people in Britain identified as non-religious. And you can see the same thing happening in France. Um, Three surveys, the same survey that was done in 2004, 2011, 2021, when people moved from 44 of respondents saying they didn't believe in God um, earlier in the century to 51%, that is majority, in 2021. Um, So, but there's a deeper significance than just numbers. And here I'm going to quote a few phrases from a Canadian philosopher called Charles Taylor, who wrote a huge book, several hundred pages long, called The Secular Age. I plowed my way all through it. It's a book which is often quoted, although I think quite ironically, most of the quotes I've seen have come from the preface. I think people didn't necessarily read the whole book. So what he is saying is, with the rejection of God, there is a new sense of self. This new sense of self means that you are shaped and directed by yourself, that is, by internal influences rather than external ones. This becomes a value. What I think, where my heart tells me to go, is more important than things outside. And Charles Taylor calls this the buffered self because it's closed to things from the outside, and meaning only comes from within oneself. So, putting it another way, looking at it from a Christian point of view, the individual has replaced God as the source of his authority of what he can or what he must do or not do. And so the conclusion of Charles Taylor is this phrase: the eclipse of all goals beyond human flourishing becomes conceivable. Human flourishing, that is the way that I personally flourish, my personal happiness, which becomes more and more an immediate happiness, not a long-term one. This becomes the most important thing in life. So you're not going to give yourself to a cause which might lead to your death, for example, because dying is not particularly consistent with your personal human flourishing. So I like to use this word plausible in this context. Now, plausible means this is something which should be taken into consideration. I recently heard someone who said, it never occurred to me to go to church because church wasn't plausible. It was something that never even crossed his mind. So this is the problem in today's secular society, that religion or the Christian faith doesn't even cross people's mind. As a little parenthesis, a lot of our apologetics is on the level of credibility, which means, is it true? Can it be believed? And this is important, but people are not yet asking that question. They're not even thinking that it might be a possibility. The Christian faith is a possibility that should be looked into. So this is our challenge. In today's world, it's to make Christianity plausible and to show that our faith is good. Before showing it's true, we need to show that it's good and helpful and helps us to flourish. And it's interesting that the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, in his Pensée, which was before the Age of Enlightenment, actually says this: men despise religion, they hate it, they're afraid it may be true. Make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then the credibility, then show that it is. And one way of expressing this is using the expression a better story. This is the title of a book by Glyn Harrison, which I would recommend, A Better Story. And he quotes Greek mythology to show this. Um, the first story is Ulysses. There are these mythical creatures, the sirens, which some people think are a bit like mermaids who sang, and the sailors were attracted to their voices and went over to the rocks, and their shops sank. And Ulysses wanted to hear the songs. And he said, okay, the sailors must put wax in their ears, they can't hear. He could be attracted to the mast, and you can go through. Orpheus, on the other hand, wonderful musician, played in the front of the ship on his lyre, and his music was better than the singing of the mermaids, the sirens, and so the ship went through. So we're saying we want to sing a better song. We want to have a better story. And this is the diagram, I sometimes call it an infographic, that sounds more modern, which summarizes the approach that I'm suggesting all over Europe and which we are using in the Clichy Church. We're saying we want to be a healthy church. Three things to make it a healthy church: centered on the gospel, a place where Christians learn to love God and to love others within their cultural context. And the way that this will be lived out is by saying we gather as a church, and we're also church when we're scattered. And 97% of our time is spent in the scattered church. Even the most passionate Christian will probably not spend more than 3% in church meetings. But the church meetings, organized events, are there to edify, that is, build up the Christians and train them to be good witnesses in the scattered church. Why is this? Well, in the scattered church, we're in contact with people, and this contact we have with people in our day-to-day relationships, family, colleagues at work, neighbors, people in our leisure activities. This is the only contact they often have with the Christian faith, with Christians. And so, what we're trying to say, and this fits in very much in today's society, we are the users of the Christian faith, the recommenders, in the same way that when someone orders something on the internet, they very often, well, my wife often does that, not just what the manufacturer says. What is even more important is what do other users say? And we are the users of the faith. We can recommend it. And so when we're together, we need to remember that we are there to motivate and equip Christians to share the gospel with grace and truth in all areas of life. In other words, we meet together to prepare the messengers, and we prepare in two ways. We motivate through our praise, our Bible teaching, so that, as Jesus says, the mouth will speak of what our heart is full of. And we equip Christians by trying to help them to understand the world we're in. And so when we meet together as a church, we try to use these four different aspects of a church service. Maybe Tom will say more about this. Our aims, AIMS, adoration, that's worship and amazement at God's grace towards us. Issues, understanding the world. So we try to teach on different issues in our church services to train disciples to live into secular society, both to be uh, to be protected from the seduction of other ideas, but also to build bridges with non-Christians. And mission, sending out the congregation as a scattered church, and by using the scriptures, that is our Bible teaching, our preaching. So just a couple of resources. I've already mentioned the book Reconnect Your Church. There's also a bilingual website I've set up, revitalisation.fr, in which you can find an enormous amount of resources which might help you think out the question of being a healthy church in secular society.